meeting in this municipal year of this Scrutiny board. Welcome in particular to all the new members. I see that 8 out of the 13 members of the board are new to this board. 1 or 2 may have substituted in the past, so you may have some prior knowledge of it. Right, before we start, I'm going to go around the members of the board, asking them to introduce themselves for the benefit not just of officers, but of any members of the public who have tuned in. I will ask the officers to introduce themselves at a later stage for the item that they're in attendance on. So perhaps Sharon, you could start.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Councillor Sharon Hamilton, Moortown and Meanwood Ward.
Morning, everybody. I'm Councillor Nicole Sharp from the Temple Newsham Ward.
Good morning, everyone. Councillor Mohammed Shazad from the Moortown and Meanwood Ward.
Morning, everybody. Councillor Arif Hussain from Gibson and Hare Hills.
Morning, John Galvani from Horsforth Ward.
Morning, Isaac Wilson, Wheatwood Ward.
Morning, Councillor Winkid, Jamali South.
Good morning, everyone. Councillor Paul Alderson, Guiseley and Rodham Ward.
Morning, everybody. Mike Foster from Ardsley and Robin Hood.
Morning, Councillor Neil Buckley, Woodley Ward.
And good morning, I'm Paul Truswell. I represent Middleton and Belle Isle and I chair this scrutiny board. Right, turning to the agenda, get the usual housekeeping things out of the way very quickly. Agenda item 1, appeals, there are no appeals. Agenda item 2, exclusion of the public, there are no items for which this is applicable. Late items, number 3, there are no late items. Agenda item 4, declarations of interest. I'm assuming that no one has got any declarations to make at this stage. Agenda item 5, apologies. We've received apologies from Councillor Pryor and and Jonathan Moxon, who's the flood risk manager. That takes us on to agenda item 6, which is on page 5 of your agenda papers, the minutes of the last meeting. I know it's difficult for 2/3 of the new members to comment on these, but I will go through them page by page. And if you've got any corrections or any matters arising, please indicate and I'll come to you. So page 5, page 6, page 7, page 8, page 9, page 10, page 11, page 12. We were really busy bees at that last meeting. So in the absence of any comments or any corrections, are members content for me to sign those as a correct record? Yeah, okay, thank you very much. That takes us on to agenda item 7, terms of reference, which really is just for information. I don't think any questions are likely to arise from them. If they do, they're set in concrete, so there's not a lot we can do about them. Okay, can we just note those? Thank you. Agenda item 8, co-opter members. This board, certainly in the, God, it's 8 years since I've been chairing, has never had any co-opter members, simply because we've never found the need. But that doesn't preclude us, if we want to bring any external expertise to help us in our discussions about any particular issue on the agenda, to do that on an ad hoc basis. So if that's okay, I'll move on to agenda item 9, which is really the first substantive item on the agenda, and that's the performance update from City Development, Children and Families and Chief Executive. Unfortunately, this is part 2 of our discussions about the KPIs, in that we started looking at them in January, but unfortunately, as a result of a combination of officer absence, illness, leave, we weren't able to cover all of them. So we took the decision to postpone consideration of those that we couldn't cover to this first meeting. Before I ask officers to introduce this, I just want to make a point from my own point of view, and I did mention this to members in the pre-meeting, those who were able to attend. I don't think this new method of reporting KPIs is as useful as the previous system. The comparisons year on year, and especially given the fact that the last 2 years have been somewhat abnormal for reasons we're always aware of, I don't think is as helpful as some of the past reports that we've had that have actually given us tables or other means of looking back several years, in some cases 10, 15 years. So we've been able to see the trajectory and the performance, good, bad or indifferent, over time. And that's a point that I would hope the board would endorse, that we can actually clearly express to officers now, but feed back into the system, because I understand, as part of the change over to the best city ambition, that the key performance indicators are being reviewed anyway. And also, as I say, I don't think a year-on-year comparison with two pretty abnormal years is useful anyway. And finally, I just reiterate the fact that we've got so many new members of the board. I really think, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, that they would appreciate seeing the background and the history that the previous approach used to give us. We also, and there is some attempt to do this with some of the KPIs, used to find it very useful to have comparisons with core cities and other statistical names, i.e. other local authorities that have a similar makeup to ours. So with that, I don't know, Martin, whether you want to comment on what I've just said, but I will ask you and your colleagues to introduce the KPIs. What I intend to do is that once you've introduced them, is to go through them one by one so we can focus any questions or discussion or comment on that KPI as we move forward, rather than butterflying around the whole piece. Okay, I'll draw breath now and let you introduce the report.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, by way of introduction, I'm Martin Farrington. I'm the Director of City Development, so I'll take the lead in terms of going through the indicators this morning. But perhaps if we start...
Sorry, Martin, my apologies. I did say that at this juncture I would ask the officers and, of course, the Executive Board member to introduce themselves. So perhaps we could start on my left. Tim.
Good morning, Tim Rollett from the Council's Intelligence and Policy Service, and we coordinate the KPIs and also corporate risks.
Good morning. I'm very jealous of having intelligence as part of your title. My name is Councillor Helen Hayden. I represent Temple News Award and Executive Member for Infrastructure and Climate. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Gary Bartlett. I'm Chief Officer for Highways and Transportation.
Good morning, I'm Eve Roothouse and I'm Chief Officer for Culture and Economy.
Good morning, I'm Heather Davis. I'm a Principal Planning Officer within Policy and Plans, and I have particular responsibilities for affordable housing.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Apologies again. Fire away.
No, you're welcome. No, you're fine. And then just in terms of the comments you were making on the format of the reports, I mean, it's Tim's team that pulls together, and I'm beholden on Tim's resources of how he does that and does it in a way that's consistent across all of the scrutinies of the council. So I think the points you've made, Chair, are well laid out and understood. So I mean, I can pick that up with Tim, and then well, I think it will be a corporate matter as well in terms of the approach going forward.
That's right. And as part of this refresh of the KPIs that support the new Best City ambition, we're intending on consulting with all the Scrutiny Board chairs, possibly at the same time, so that we can agree exactly what we're going to report, but also the level of depth that we want to report against the KPIs. It might surprise you, but there was a wide range of variance between some of the KPIs reported to this board and some of the other boards. And so we were just looking for a little bit of consistency and standardization. But clearly, I take your point about the usefulness of historical information. So that's something that we will discuss with yourself and the other Scrutiny Board chairs in the autumn, well before we report next time, early next year.
Okay, so if it's okay with you, Chair, if I go through the PIs in the report, and then colleagues be able to answer any questions, and if members want to look in more depth at any matters, we can do so. So in terms of the reports of the indicators. The first one considers employment in Leeds. That shows that the provisional outturn for 2020 is 461,188 people, which is a reduction of 11,856. In terms of the split on that, 379,162 are private and 82,026 are public. Turning to unemployment, unemployment rose between 2020 and 2021 from 4.1% to 5.5%. So that's an increase of 1.4 percentage points. The average rate across core cities at this over this period was 6.5%. So we sit well within that, but we are above the UK average of 4.5%. We then turn to gross value added, so GVA per job, per filled job, and effectively that's a measure of the value of the economy in terms of expressed at a productivity level for each individual job. Between 2018 and 2019, that rose from 53,311 to 55,206. So that's an increase of 1,895 per job. And then in terms of new business startups, between 2020 and 2021, that has fallen. This is an indicator that is using figures from Bank Search, compiling information from Companies House, High Street Business Bank Account, Open Data, etc. For the first 3 months, 2022, there were 1,093 business startups in Leeds. That's 8.5% fewer business startups compared with the corresponding period from the previous year. That places Leeds as ranked as 66 out of 309 English district authorities. In terms of the number of business scale-ups, that has increased between 2019 and 2020, going from 585 to 605. The result of 605 is made up of 200 businesses showing over 20% growth in employment and 405 businesses showing over 20% growth in turnover. On the business survival rate, that fell between 2019 and 2020 from 42.9% to 40.8%. So that's minus 2.1 percentage points. And within that, PI, Leeds ranked third of the core cities, sitting behind Bristol and Sheffield. In terms of changes in the business rates payable since 2017, there's been a marginal increase from the 1st of April 2021 to the 31st of March 2022. The change is 0.26%, so that's an increase from 462.9 million to 464.14. On the visitor economic impact of Leeds, shows a marked reduction from the period 2019 to 2020, principally as a consequence of the pandemic. So it fell from 1,890 million to 891 million during that period. On the percentage of working age Leeds residents with at least a level 4 qualification, between 2020 and 2021, that fell by minus 1.1 percentage points from 46.9 to 45.8. And on the number of people supported to improve their skills, that's something that we've been able to maintain throughout the pandemic, albeit at a reduced level. So the figure for 2021 is 2,485 people against a target of 6,450. Numbers of people supported into work, again, has a target of 3,500, and the 21-22 figure is 3,473 people. So close to the target on achieving that one. And of those numbers, 1,828, so that's 53% of residents securing employment were from the 20% most deprived local super output areas as measured in the indices of multiple deprivation. Turning to growth of new homes in Leeds, the annual target is 3,247 homes. Between April and December 2021, we'd achieved 2,197 homes. So that leaves 1,050 in the final quarter to be achieved. The third quarter is normally the slowest quarter of the four. So I think it's fair to say that the 3,247 for this year is probably a stretch target, but I think that the detail that I've had to date says that we will be somewhere close to achieving that. And I think one of the aspects that has come into play there is in terms of supply chain. Supply chain challenges slowing the rate of build down. On the numbers of affordable homes delivered, the annual target is 434. Plus a 796 per annum backlog. For the period April to December 2021, we have 331 homes delivered. So we're waiting for the final fourth quarter to understand the outturn position for that one. And then residential developments built to the required accessible and adaptable AA standards. This is based on policy H10, and it requires all new build housing developments to have 30% accessible and adaptable standards to be achieved. Following further investigations become apparent we're not able to accurately monitor accessible housing completions on a dwelling by dwelling within our existing monitoring system, and we're able to accurately monitor the number of planning permissions granted for accessible dwellings, and the available data is then shown. And that indicates that for quarter two, the planning permissions achieved was 762 to achieve the accessible and adaptable standard, and for quarter three, that was 420. Progress 8 scores and the NEETs, their children's services led PIs, so I won't comment on those, Councillor Trustwell, but turning to number 17, the number of people killed or seriously injured, that's 131 people between January and March 2022. That's against a target of 269. The 131 people is a significant increase on the previous years, particularly noting that during the previous years, there's two things. One, much quieter traffic because of the pandemic, and so those figures reduced. And secondly, because the way in which serious incidences are now recorded, there's a change in the definition, and therefore that figure has increased. And then satisfaction with a range of transport services. In 2018-19, that was 6.7 out of 10, and it's fallen to 6.6 out of 10 for 2020-21, so a marginal reduction there. That data is provided by the West Yorkshire Combined Authority from their annual tracker survey. And then number of passengers boarding buses in the Leeds district. In 2020, it was 32.9 million. The provisional outturn for 2021 is 37.5 million. So that is an increase of 4.6 million, but it's a significantly reduced figure from normal that is still recovering from the pandemic. Increase in city centre travel by sustainable transport, bus, train, cycling and walking. The latest survey took place in autumn 2021, so the results are expected later this year. And then the number of residential and commercial properties moved to a lower level of flood risk. There's been an increase of 53 residential properties that are now protected since the 2020 figure was collated, and an extra 3 commercial. And principally, that's the conclusion of the Otley FAS scheme, Chair, which was concluded earlier this year. So that's the headlines of those PIs, and happy to answer or receive any questions.
Okay, thank you, Martin. So I'm going to go through them page by page unless anyone disputes that. So on page 41, we've got 3 KPIs: employment in Leeds, unemployment in Leeds, and gross value added. Does anyone have any questions or comments to make on those figures? No. Okay. Turning the page 42. 4, 5, and 6, number of new business startups, number of business scale-ups, business survival rates. Any questions on those? Yes, Sharon.
Just on the decrease in the business startup, is it business that have gone bust and not returned? I'm sorry, is it, yeah, new businesses that haven't applied? Just explain in what way you're saying that it's been decreased as a new startup.
Thanks, Councillor. So on this page, there's a number of indicators, and the first indicator around number of new business startups is about registration of new businesses with Companies House and so on. The business survival rate one is when a business when a business is wound up. So those two things together are giving you a sense of what's happening in the city. So I think given what we've been through over the past 2 years, you might expect that we would have a small, a reduction in the number of people having the confidence to start a new business in that context, and that we would have an increased number of businesses failing because of the tough conditions associated with the pandemic. But I think probably what's really a positive thing is that the business scale-up data is showing that even throughout COVID, we had some businesses in Leeds that were being very successful in terms of scaling up, and that means that they're creating new jobs in the city. So that's actually a really positive thing, that we've got that scale up trend there in those 3. So I hope that helps, Councillor.
Right, thank you for that. I think you've probably answered this question in terms of your response to Councillor Hamilton, Eve, but for number 4, the 3rd paragraph, for the first 3 months of 2022, there were 11% fewer business startups. And that, in a way, seems slightly counterintuitive, given the fact that the pressures of the pandemic and the depressive nature of that on business was prior to that. And you would almost anticipate kind of the shackles having been released, and that we might be seeing more businesses created.
Thanks, Chair. So I think probably a couple of things. Obviously, it's difficult to remember, but in the first 3 months of the year, we were still under some, impacts of COVID, actually. But also, there are wider, things going on in the economy as well, in terms of some of the sort of wider uncertainties around inflation and other issues. So we probably need to keep an eye on these numbers to see what happens over the next few months, given the volatility in the economy at the moment.
Okay, thanks for that, Eve. So moving on to page 43 and KPIs 7 and 8, changing business rates and visitor economic impact for Leeds. Any questions, Sharon?
Visitors economic impact for Leeds. We notice, obviously, and we know why there's been a massive reduction. My question is we're starting to see pick up, and when are we going to get that indication of where we are now? I mean, obviously, it's a massive reduction, but we all know the reason why. And also, can we, I know you mentioned it before about rather than just 2019 and 2020, if we could see prior, so, and obviously the 2 year and a half gap and going forward, please.
Thanks, Councillor. I anticipated someone might ask this question. So I did look at some of the more recent data that we've got in the city to give you some indication of what's happening in this space. So the Leeds Hotels and Venues Association report that occupancy rates are showing really strong signs of recovery. And in the last 28 days, the numbers have been comparable with 2019, which is really very positive. And perhaps also not that unsurprising, because we did host a major conference in Leeds during May, which was considered to be very successful. Revenue is currently exceeding 29 levels as well, we've heard from that sector. We've got significant progress being made in conferencing, with Conference Leeds forecast for this financial year at 66% of 2019 levels. And given that the conferencing sector was the first ones impacted by COVID-19, that's something to feel positive about. And bookings for 2024 and onwards are very positive in the conference sector as well. Another indicator is that the Visit Leeds website, in May we had over 71,500 sessions, which was a 107% increase on May 21 in terms of people looking at the visitor website. So you can see that there's been quite the bounce back. I also just looked at the trends around footfall in the station, and the average weekday footfall in the station is currently around 69% of baseline levels, similar to late 2021, which is indicating a slower recovery since legal restrictions were lifted. But average weekend footfall is exceeding the baseline, which would imply that there's a stronger recovery for leisure travel into the city. So again, some really positive indications that things are beginning to recover. Finally, we do know that some of our productions in theatre and so on, there are some of the older audiences still a little reluctant to return. So there's more work to be done to sort of support certain demographics to return to the city and return to tourism and feel comfortable with that.
Neil.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It was actually more or less the same question as Councillor Hamilton's. And when you look at the figures, it's a drop of a billion, which is an enormous drop, isn't it? And just before I ask that question, just to say that I do agree with what the Chairman said about having the figures over a wider time. I think it's really important that we do that. So I do agree with that for what it's worth. But also, secondly, on the comparisons here year to year, they're actually different years. We've actually got in here from 2018 to 2022, and it's kind of a mixture, and it's very difficult to follow. So I think if that could be tidied up, that would be very helpful as well. But my question here was really about this £1 billion drop. And we were in town on Sunday morning with some friends of ours, and down in the Victoria Quarter, an awful lot of shops were vacant. And you don't actually notice them because they're very nicely covered up with nice sort of fake frontages and that kind of thing. But there are quite a few, not there. And I just wondered if that was definitely going to alter, and we're going to get more back to 100% there.
So I think I haven't got the exact figure about our latest vacancy rates in the city centre, but just checking quickly with Martin there, we think it's around 14%, but we can, Chair, just provide the latest data as by way of follow-up. We have been tracking actually slightly around and positively around the average across the UK. So we're not particularly any worse than other locations. And I know there has been a lot of positivity from some of the retailers in the city centre about brands they have been able to attract and plans that they've got underway. But what I can say is that they're going to be able to fill all those voids. But there is a positivity around Leeds, and Leeds is recognised as being very proactive around its management of the city centre and the experience in that space.
Yeah, sorry, I was just, when I was mentioning to Eve about the percentages, it tends to move between about 14 and 18%, the vacancy rate. Leeds is not out of kilter with national trends, but you would Councillor Buckley to raise that it is a post-pandemic issue, that those figures have gone up and we have to proactively manage to bring them back down to pre-pandemic levels.
And I think there was also the question that Councillor Buckley asked about the time lag between some of the figures. Some of them go back to 2020 or even 2019. And I think that's because they are externally sourced. They're not council figures. And they're the latest figures that the government department or agency produce. But Tim, I don't know if you want to just confirm that.
That's right, Councillor Trustwell. Where we get the information internally, we can get the results quite quickly, but you are right in saying that some of the information is externally sourced. So for example, the visitor economic impact, that's got a 2020 date on it. And obviously that's because the information has to be compiled and checked externally. So whenever we come to the scrutiny board, we always report the most recent information available at the time. So it is a little bit confusing, but I understand your point there.
Okay. Yeah, Mike.
Cheers. Yeah, we're talking about the £1 billion figure. I'm just wondering whether you can reconcile that number with the value of the various government and COVID grants that we've received in our economy, and whether that matches that number.
So no is the short answer. So I can't remember the exact figure off the top of my head, but it's somewhere in the region of 170 million that we gave out in grants, including the grants that went through rates. But again, I can get the exact number, but I know that it's not equating to that £1 billion figure.
Would that include things like the furlough money?
No, that wouldn't include the furlough money, and I don't know what data is available about that. So I think if you added furlough in, you would be able to, there'd be additional on top of that. So I don't know what public information there is out there. Yeah, I don't know if, Tim, you've seen any public information around furlough data.
I'm not sure, but that's something that we could go in and have a look at for you and see if we can get some figures on that.
That would be nearer to a true figure, wouldn't it, then, as a discrepancy? If you can measure that billion against the money that's actually been given by the government to the city.
But with all due respect, Mike, I'm not sure that you'll be comparing like with like. I mean, this is a kind of notional figure and a calculation. It's not based on hard cash, whereas the furlough figure would be based on hard cash, and whether it could be reduced to a figure that measured Leeds and the number of people who received a furlough payment. I'm not quite sure what the value would be of that kind of comparison. So as I say, I think we're comparing apples with pears, but maybe I'm wrong.
I mean, Chair, what we will be able to provide is, with respect to the grants that we managed, what number of or value of the grants were that we distributed to retail, leisure and hospitality sector, because it's probably the retail, leisure and hospitality sector where there's a direct comparison to this number in terms of visitor economic impact.
Okay, thank you. If there are no other questions, move on to page 44 and KPIs 9, 10 and 11. If anyone's got any questions or comments on those. If not, move on to page 45, 12 and sorry, Sharon, do you?
Mine, it might be just a silly question, but number 13, the targets, on the targets where we got 434, obviously April to December is 331. Can you explain to me the 796 backlog? And are we going to address it, or am I reading it wrong? Because if, to me, there's a backlog, so we need to play catch up or put things in place. Am I wrong, or am I reading it wrong?
No, you're exactly right, Sharon.
Yeah, I'll answer, and then Heather can interrupt me if I get this wrong. So the 434 is the annual target. The 796 is what we need to deliver in addition to that to address the backlog, and that's why it's represented there. The 331 is a 3/4 of a year figure, so I don't know what the detail will be, but I think there's an expectation that we'll be close to the 434 in terms of the annual target. And so the actions then in terms of addressing that backlog, and there, some of the figures are in the preceding commentary, where in terms of our own social housing build programme, there's 1,164 homes at various stages in development, either going through planning or on site. We highlight where we've managed to be able to bring forward and work with large registered providers such as the Guinness Partnership, who are doing Points Cross at Hunslet Road, where that 928 residential homes development has 331 affordable houses. And then last month, Plans Panel gave consent to Clarion's development, which has a similar proportion of affordable housing at scale. So when I was discussing this with colleagues last week, when you look at what's on site and coming through over 2 to 3 years, you can see a picture where this number of the number delivered in year will get to 700, that kind of number, because of what we can see coming through the pipeline, which will help to address the backlog. But there's still a lot of work to do to address it fully, if that helps.
So we'll be meeting our target, as you say. We'll be meeting our target going ahead. And plus also we'll be catching up then with regards to the backlog. So apart from, because I'm looking at it this way, by now we're gonna meet our target of 434 year in. And then plus the others, not unless I've read it wrong, we will also be, let me try and get it. Because when I read it, I trying to understand. So once we start getting our target, plus the others that are approved at Plans Panel, you're saying we'll meet that.
Based on what the foreseeable future is over the next 3 years, we'll start to make inroads. We'll start to make inroads into the backlog. Yeah.
Yeah, you've actually homed in on something that has been a source of concern and focus for this board for some years, Sharon. And as Martin has said, it looks as though we are going to be close, if not hitting the year-by-year target, but only beginning to make some inroads into that historic failure to provide affordable housing. This will be an issue that we'll go into more detail later on in the year, because we did an inquiry a few years ago into housing mix, and one of the priority areas of that is the amount of affordable housing the city is actually delivering. So that will be a further opportunity later in the municipal year to explore that in a lot more detail, because it is something that we have homed in on, as I say, before. Helen, you wanted to come in.
Yes, it's extremely challenging, but there's so much going on in terms of trying to address, but we have to wait for these homes to be built, and that takes some time. So that lag we might find in a couple of years' time, when Guinness actually, give the keys over to people and Clarion, etc., that there'll be a big glut in terms of the figures. But please rest, the board can rest assured that we are trying everything in our power. In terms of the council housing building programme, it is on track, but getting kind of the land available and is extremely challenging, and land acquisition and the use of land, it continues to be very challenging. Thank you.
Mike.
Yeah, excuse me for my ignorance on this, but just to be absolutely clear, what is the definitive figure for the backlog for affordable housing?
So it's 796 per annum, as it says in the table on 13.
I don't understand the per annum bit. Are you saying you have to build 796 additional houses every year to catch up on what figure? What figure are we chasing?
Excuse me. The figure of 796 is based on clearing the backlog in 10 years, because clearly the figure will vary according to how fast we try and clear the backlog. Now, excuse me, we are currently hoping to instruct some consultants to undertake a new strategic housing market assessment, which will review the figures. So these are the current figures available in the most recent SHMA, which is of 2017.
Can we just confirm then? Are we saying we're over 7,000 homes behind?
That's what the backlog is, yes.
I have to protest to some extent. This does not suggest that at all. And I'm very disappointed the way that's been presented to us.
I don't know if anyone wants to come back on that. I mean, it is a backlog and we can rehearse the reasons for it. And certainly there will be a discussion, as I say, later in the year about that where we can address those points. But there are a whole host of reasons which I think it would be difficult to go into in detail at this particular meeting about why there is a backlog of that nature, because the council is not its own master or mistress in terms of the number of properties that's sold. So much of that is dependent upon the market. So much of that is dependent upon the number of affordable units delivered by private developers and the pressures or otherwise that we can put on them. Because, for example, I know there are many cases where we try and get developers to build affordable houses as part of their planning permissions, and they come running back and waive the government's legal requirement for them to be allowed to build those within what is financially appropriate, financially achievable for them. So I think if we just take that crude figure, it needs unpicking. There is a great deal of detail as to why that backlog has occurred, and that is not down to this council, or not exclusively to this council. There are a lot of much more complex reasons for it, and I'd be happy for us again to explore them when we come back to the housing mix inquiry and the update on it, because it is an incredibly important part of what this committee has oversight of, how we deliver more affordable housing to the people of this city who desperately need it, whether it's council housing or affordable housing provided by registered providers like housing associations. Mohammed.
Sorry, Chair, could I just come in on that? Sorry. Also, we've got the local plan update 2 coming, starting in the autumn, so which will focus on affordable housing. We also, the councils up and down the country found it very difficult to build council houses until the borrowing cap was lifted. And as soon as it was by the government, then this council swung into action in terms of building as many council houses as was feasible. So yeah, it's going to be a very big part of our work when the local plan update 1, which focuses on the climate emergency, is concluded. The local plan update 2 will be focused on affordable housing and getting it right for the city. Thank you.
Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So can we just clear this up, because we're all a bit confused with the figures now? That was our original target around over 1,100 affordable houses per year, and so that's why we got a 796 per annum backlog per year, because we're not reaching that target. Or how are we going back 10 years? Because there's a bit of a confusion here now. So we said we were going to cover that in 3 years, and now we're saying we're going back 10 years. So can we get some clarity, please?
Yeah, I'll try and provide the clarity. So currently, in recent years, we've delivered around the annual target of 434. I think last year we exceeded that. this year, it's probably going to hit around the annual target. What I'm saying is when you look at what's on the ground, both in terms of developments privately by registered social landlords like the Guinness Partnership, and what we're doing in terms of our social housing build portfolio, you can see that rising to circa 700. So every unit above the annual target of 434 contributes against that backlog. It will make inroads into that backlog, which is the position that I've said. But the backlog in terms of underperformance going back historically over the planned period is what is shown there.
Councillor Galvani.
Thank you, Chair. But surely the target isn't 434. It's nearly 12. It's around about the 1200. Shouldn't that just be shown as the one figure?
Well, there's the annual target and there's a backlog. If you add them together, you get that cumulative target. That's correct.
But surely for clarity, that should be what the target is, because we're still trying to make up that backlog.
That's the overall target. That's correct, yes.
Not wanting to complicate it any further, but the fact that we have two figures quoted to us, the year on year and then the backlog, I think is a result of public inquiries and the way planning inspectors have looked at the provision of housing and have said that in year, this is the figure you need to achieve or exceed in terms of in year on year building. But because we haven't provided sufficient affordable housing in the past, this is a further figure that's added on to that. So I think that two-tier system, for want of a better expression, actually is a product of the planning process and planning inspectors' comments and guidance, rather than an attempt by the council to kind of, escape the fact that overall we need to 1,200 properties plus. But again, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's correct, Councillor.
I mean, this is an issue that, as I say, has always exercised members, the fact that there's a desperate need for affordable housing of whatever nature in the city. And I know that on page 47, under KPI 13, there's reference to a delivery partnership plan, which is currently being put together with partners to address the challenges at least over the next 3 years. And could I ask Martin, what's the latest state of play with that plan, and when might you be in a position to share it with members? Because I think it would be a very useful document, a very useful vehicle for further discussion of this issue for us, whether it came to a full meeting of the board or perhaps we had a working group around it. But I'll be guided by your advice as to when it would be in a form that we could look at.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So there's two reports that we're pulling together at the moment for future consideration by Executive Board. One is the affordable housing plan, and the second is in terms of our council house build programme and where that is and how we want to take it to the next stage, and in terms of new sites that we can bring forward. Ideally, I'd like to bring those two reports to Executive Board at the same time, because they have an interrelationship between each other. I think we're working towards September, so I mean, I'll be guided by Councillor Hayden, but I think the opportunity for scrutiny in the lead up to that would be welcome.
So when might they actually come to this board? September or July? I mean, do you want it to go to Executive Board before it comes to us, or can it come to us in a draft form for our comments to Executive Board?
I think it'd be better, more productive if it comes here first, Chair. Perhaps if I
we would say amen to that.
Yeah, if I liaise with Becky on timings, I've just got to liaise with the report authors and just check that what works. But we can set out something that. Yeah,
and I appreciate there are probably other people that you and Councillor Hayden need to consult with about it. Yes, Helen.
Yes, I was briefed on it this week, and it will be written in all, in July, basically. But we just need to check with some outside with partners before submitting in September. We don't want to rush it. So that's why we're looking at the September date. But given that August is very quiet time for everybody in the city, really. So that's why it would be coming to September, but it will be more or less written. Well, it will be written by July with just some details and data to check with partners before September.
Okay, I mean, certainly in the light of the history of our discussions and again, the focus today, I think it would be very welcome. And if we can get in on the ground floor on that, then so much the better. I think it's something that Scrutiny is actually designed to do. Neil.
Just on this subject of council housing, there'll always be political differences about how to deliver affordable housing in one form or another. But at the moment, we've got a council house building programme in a fairly limited numbers, but we've also got right to buy. And I'm sure I've asked for this before, and if I've missed it, it's my fault. But do we have figures that show the total and then the net? So in other words, for every 1,000 council houses, we've built another 100, but we've sold 103. Or how? And is that kind of information available on a ward basis, please?
In terms of exercising right to buy, that information is available. It's not something that it'll be managed by the HRA, but I mean, I can take that away and get you those figures. Certainly, I think last year there was 600 right to buys exercised in the city. So if you look at the work where I think in that year, as I reported, we delivered close to 600 affordable houses. So you've got a position where there's a lot of work to effectively stand still in that position. But I can get you the actual figures if that helps you to detail that.
Yeah, I think it was 603. So yeah, I think that's it. That's sticking in my mind of right to buy. I haven't seen any ward breakdown data, and we are trying to buy back as well. But essentially, we're running to standstill.
It would be very helpful because in my ward, we've got two areas which you're probably familiar with, which people refer to as the council estates, but actually probably 50% are owner occupied. And it would be quite handy to know which way the figures are going.
I think it's fair to say, as Councillor Hayden's indicated, that we're not even running to stand still. I don't think we're standing still. I mean, if you allow an old fogey to reminisce, when I was first elected to this council in 1982, and I hardly believe it's 40 years ago, I think we had almost 100,000 council properties. I think the figure is now down to about 55, mainly as a result of the right to buy. There have been some clearance areas which may account for a few hundred or a few thousand of those, but basically it's down to the right to buy and the failure of successive governments, it's not a party political issue, to give local authorities the capacity to build more council housing to replace that which has been sold. And I seem to recollect that a certain Prime Minister a few years ago, when he increased the concession to tenants in terms of the cost of council housing, said that they would build one new house for every one sold. It never happened. I think the other thing to bear in mind is, unless again I'm wrong about this, although we are building comparatively few compared to the number of properties that have been sold, Leeds does actually have a good record when compared to other authorities up and down the country as to the number of council houses it is now building as an authority. But again, it's extremely frustrating because irrespective of political party, we're all deluged as members with people in desperate housing circumstances who seek our assistance. And I think it's probably one of the most soul-destroying parts of role of being a councillor, that at the end of the day, there just aren't the properties to meet the need. I think we've got something like almost 7,000 people with A+ and A priority, not to mention the 24,000 people on the actual list, waiting list, as we call it. And we just nowhere near touching that. So people are having to wait years even when they're in desperate need. And I think, I think there is consensus politically that ideally we should have been doing much more about it, but to some extent, to a very great extent, we've been constrained by what the governments, successive governments, have enabled us to do. Here endeth the lesson. But I think that's the position. I don't think there is any disparity. There may be differences. For example, I believe that the right to buy has created a housing crisis, but it's created a housing crisis because we haven't replaced the houses that have been sold with other council housing. But I think we could debate this forever and a day, and we're kind of slightly moving away from this particular key performance indicator, but the issue is definitely an important one. And I think I need to stress as well from the chair that our role in terms of housing provision is on the planning basis and more strategic. I think the specifics about building council houses and the council's policy and the council's approach actually falls within the remit of another scrutiny board. But I think we've always exercised a latitude that while ever housing and the provision of housing, affordable or otherwise, falls within our remit in terms of planning, then we will continue to discuss it as members and to rehearse our concerns about the shortfalls. Right, okay. If there are no other questions on those performance indicators, I'll take us to page 47 and residential developments built to required accessibility and adaptable standards. Don't know if there are any questions on those.
Just a quick one.
Yeah, go on, Sharon.
Please. Just regarding the 30%, are we accessible and adaptable and 2% wheelchair? Are we on targets for those or what? Or is it just being written? Are we meeting, are they meeting those targets?
Yeah, so the 30% and the 2% of the provisions in the policy. What the paper does show is the numbers that then flow through the planning system as a consequence of that policy. What I'll do, Councillor Hamilton, is I'll just check that back and provide you with a written response.
Ooh. You can just send it to all of us, so that we know if they are meeting the targets.
Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. I think it goes without saying that when members request information, we do prefer it to be sent to all members of the board. I think that's kind of... Well done, Sharon. So, yeah, so if all information, such as the items that have been discussed earlier in the meeting, they may have been raised by one member, but I think it's as well, given the fact that they've been raised in a meeting of the board, that they are circulated to all members of the board via Becky, if you wish to do it that way. Okay, so that takes us on to page 48 and KPIs 15 and 16, progress 8 scores and the percentage of needs. This is a kind of overlap area with children and families. And if we were exercised by any of this, then we'd need to refer it, I think, to that scrutiny board. But nevertheless, it comes to us because it's part of the sort of employment portfolio and employability portfolio. But I don't know if there are any questions or any comments that anyone wants to make on these. Okay. Moving on to page 49, and again, another KPI which has exercised members over the years to such an extent that in the last municipal year, rather than simply looking at the KSI figures, we conducted a more in-depth inquiry together with a number of partners, not the least of which were the parent campaigners of young people who have died on our roads. And I think those of us who were present at those sessions, and clearly it's only a minority of us here today, were very, very moved by the testaments that we received from them. The inquiry is now complete, and as you will see from the work programme, the final draft will be coming to our next meeting. So there will be obviously an opportunity to discuss it. There won't be an opportunity to reopen the whole issue because obviously it was subject of a detailed inquiry. And it may be that a separate session, a working group or a briefing on that prior to the meeting might be useful. But I will circulate members to see what their views are on that. But as I say, the definitive report from that inquiry will be coming to our next meeting. Having said that, does anyone want to raise any questions on 17? Yeah, Isaac.
Just a quick follow-up question to what you were saying, Chair. What was that inquiry into? The causes or the impact, or what was that inquiry about?
It was into road safety, and it was predicated on the fact that over the last decade, the number of people killed and seriously injured on our roads in Leeds has departed quite substantially from the targets that were set in, I think, 2010. But Gary, perhaps you could elucidate on that. And of course, we brought together a number of partners, highways, police, campaigners, people from the community, to identify what could be done and what is being done in order to, reduce the number of people who are seriously injured on our roads. And the linchpin really of that approach is our newly adopted Vision Zero with partners, with the notion that we will not accept any deaths or serious injuries on our roads, and that we must continue to put downward pressure in every way we can to reduce those figures. But Gary, I don't know if you want to come in on this.
Thank you, Chair. I think you've covered it. I think it followed discussions in a way similar to the one we just had about affordable housing, where members around the table were very concerned about the statistics around road safety and where they were at, because each fatality or serious injury is obviously of great significance to the families concerned and local communities. So the conversations that we had prompted that scrutiny review, which had a wide remit, and we had obviously the police there, and as Councillor Trustwell has said, members of families who have lost loved ones. So it was very emotive, but I think very productive and very useful. So hopefully the next session that we have, you can see the remit and the extent of the work that we're doing. And I would say that Leeds is leading the way here in terms of adopting this Vision Zero strategy, certainly in West Yorkshire. And at the Vision Zero board yesterday that Councillor Hayden attended with myself and colleagues, we're pushing forward on some changes we want to see, for example, on safety camera guidance and criteria. So we're taking this very seriously, and hopefully that will come out in subsequent meetings.
Thank you, Gary. I think we'll be able to share a draft of that report with members of this board, probably before the next agenda needs to go out. Becky?
Yeah, it's ready to go. So.
It's ready to go. So ready to go means we can share it as soon as possible. And then I think we can discuss how we deal with it at the next board meeting. I think the difficulty is that because there are so many new members of the board, there will be an understandable temptation to want to cover all the issues that we've already covered previously. So as I say, it may be that if members are so minded, we actually have a working group to look at that so that people can get up to speed and express their views about the draft as it exists at the moment, rather than trying to do that on the hoof in a normal public meeting of the board. It would still have to come back to the board for ratification, but I think that might be the way forward. Okay, right. So moving on to page 51, satisfaction with a range of transport services, number of passengers boarding buses, increase in city centre travel by sustainable means, and number of residential and commercial properties. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, Mo.
Chair, apologies, it's slightly going back. I did have my hand up, but you missed it. There's a lot of mention on page 50, appendix 1, about the social blog where all the road traffic changes and highway code changes are being advertised on Facebook and on some sort of blog, but I've never come across it. So can we get a link to those blogs by any chance?
Yeah, it'll be through Connecting Leeds, which is our team that pushed these information out, but I can provide the links to Becky for dissemination.
So with that, moving on to page 51. Are there any questions on 18, 19, 20 and 21? Don't see anyone indicating. That just takes us over the page to devolution and the LEP, which I think is more an information item than it is a KPI. Okay, so if there are no other questions and comments on the performance indicators, I'd like to thank Councillor Hayden and the officers for their attention and their detailed responses to our questions. And we'll see you next time. Whatever, guys. So perhaps we could get the officers in for the next agenda item. And Councillor Illingworth. Right, I think the officers and Councillor Illingworth are in place for the next agenda item. If we could move to it, please. So agenda item 10, this is a referral to the board by Councillor Illingworth. Obviously, you've read the paper, you'll have read John's original email to me, which I think I received, John, 1 hour before the meeting to which it related. So I'm sure you understood why members of the board decided to defer it to a further meeting, given the fact that all the remaining meetings for the municipal year already had fairly packed agendas. Before I give John the opportunity to speak to us for 10 minutes and to amplify his concerns, I think the officers, and I'm not sure whether the technology is now working. I know that there have been 1 or 2 glitches with it, but I think we have an introduction from Richard Dennis, and Richard will introduce himself together with the other officers in due course, just to put us in the picture regarding FAS 2. So Richard and officers, if you could introduce yourselves. I don't think Helen, Gary and Martin need to introduce themselves again. They've already done that.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Richard Dennis and I work within City Development as the Civil Engineering Manager, responsible for the delivery of the River Air Fluviation Scheme, which is commonly referred to as the Leeds FAS. Alongside me.
Yeah. Good morning, I'm Peter Charlesworth from BMM JV. We're the consortium that are designing and building the FAS scheme. I've been involved since its inception with the design.
Okay, thank you, Richard. As I said, I think you've got a brief slide introduction to give us the overall picture of FAS.
It's just a short overview presentation, which should take around 5 or 6 minutes. It doesn't seem to be displaying the full screen, Becky. Is it possible to zoom out a little bit? I wonder. I think it's cutting off the bottom part. Yeah, that's much better. There you go.
There we go.
And Becky, you've kindly offered to flip through the slides, so thank you very much for that. If we go on to the first slide, there we go. So in terms of a brief background, the records of flooding Leeds during the 17th century, but the earliest photos we have for 1946 and 47. As you can see, flooding in Leeds is no new thing, and the frequency of such events appears to be increasing. Then on Boxing Day 2015, Storm Eva brought a 1 in 200 year flood event, which saw the river reach record-breaking levels with 360 tonnes of water per second moving along the river compared to 15 tonnes in normal flow conditions, and levels much higher than the 1866 event when a number of lives were lost. The difference in depth between the two events is shown by the red markers in the photo at the bottom right. It's worth emphasising the workforce in Leeds totals 500,000, with a huge number travelling to the city centre from surrounding areas every day. So in many ways, it's very fortunate this happened during the holiday period. It's taken some considerable time for homeowners and tenants to move back into properties. And although grants were provided, some businesses and jobs have been lost altogether. And so the impacts of Storm Eva will be felt for years to come. So in order to reduce the flood risk to Leeds, there was an initial proposal led by the Environment Agency, which would have cost more than £180 million at the time and brought walls in excess of 3 metres high in places in the city centre. However, this was abandoned due to funding issues at the time. Subsequently, the City Council produced a phased approach, as shown on this slide, which along with local funds and cross-party support in Leeds, led to momentum to drive forward phase 1 to start with. In terms of phase 2, there wasn't any government funding to begin with. After the Boxing Day floods, some money was provided, although not enough, and so this was initially split into 2 steps. Step 2 being works to the flood storage area at Calverley, and step 1 being everything else. So just very briefly on phase 1 though, we received approval in winter 2013, and then this fast-paced multiple award-winning scheme took only 4 years to complete, reducing the risk of devastating physical and economic damage which occurs from flooding, while supporting the infrastructure for the wider region and encouraging investment. The main components were the removal of an 800-metre length island to merge the river and the canal, linear defences in public realm areas, and innovative movable weirs at Nostrop and Crown Point, which have placed Leeds at the cutting edge of national flood defence schemes. All of these result in the city centre benefit from a 1 in 100-year standard protection. So in terms of phase 2, fast 2, following the widespread devastation caused by the Boxing Day flood, the government issued a brief and gave some funding assurances. We again have moved at pace to comply with the criteria set and bring forward a scheme that prevents a reoccurrence of the Boxing Day flood. At a total cost of £112 million for both steps, all the funding was eventually secured in January 2021. And works are progressing on site, meaning we are on course to complete this critical programme of work 15 months from now. So this slide shows some of the linear defences which have now been completed. The linear defences are one of 3 components of Fast 2, the other 2 being flood storage and natural flood management, which all combined will deliver a 1 in 200-year standard protection with an allowance for climate change to the year 2069. Importantly, the works being delivered by Fast 2 will also uplift the 1 in 100-year standard protection delivered in the city centre as part of Fast 1 to the 1 in 200-year standard. In terms of linear defence zones, there are 10 in total, 2 of which are now complete, 7 are currently under construction, and 1 is commencing shortly. So this slide shows the works currently under construction for the flood storage area at Calverley. This is a heavy piece of civil engineering which will operate like a dam in a 1 in 100-year storm event and hold water back from Kirksville and the city centre. The temporary cofferdam shown in the photos is roughly twice the size of an Olympic swimming pool in length and depth. Although once complete, the temporary work structure will be removed and virtually all the works will be submerged and never visible again. The third and final component of Fast 2 is the natural flood management measures. This catchment-wide programme comprises of a variety of features which will bring a transformational change, significantly contributing to the realising of the northern forests in the Air catchment. With the planting of 2 million trees, it is one of the largest catchment management schemes in Europe. Good progress has been made already with almost 500,000 trees and over 13,000 metres of hedgerow planted so far. So to conclude, the vision for Leeds is to be the best city in the UK. one that's compassionate and care with a strong economy, which tackles poverty and reduces inequalities. A key element of the Leeds Inclusive Growth Strategy is supporting people, place and productivity through the provision of 21st century infrastructure. In line with the Council's Best Council Plan, the scheme will make communities more resilient, support the further growth and regeneration of the Leeds economy, and protect key transportation infrastructure and the high quality public services it supports. So in a decade since the conception of the Phase 1 proposals, and at a total cost of £162 million, the city will have the benefit of a holistic 1 in 200 year stand protection with allowance for climate change, reducing the risk of the devastating physical and economic damage which can occur from flood events. So that brings me to the end, which I hope everyone found useful.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard. Right, turning to Councillor Illingworth. The board has agreed that you should have 10 minutes to elaborate on, obviously, on the email that you sent to me initially that prompted this referral. So, John, your time starts now. I should add that John did bring along a document that he wanted to circulate, and it's 6 closely typed pages. Now, board members may wish to see that in due course, but it seemed to me that it's a rather indigestibly long piece of writing to be tabled on the day, John. So maybe in future, if you could just give us a little bit of notice and give members the opportunity to read a document of that type prior to the meeting, I think we would certainly welcome that. But I'm sure that you will be able to raise all the points in your written document in a slightly more cursory fashion when you speak with us. So over to you. Your time starts now.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'd like to start off by recording my admiration for the flood team, because I'm going to be critical today and say there are factors you've overlooked, but still it is the best flood team in the country by a long chalk. And I'm very, very happy and proud to be working alongside them and giving my input. So it needs to be said. Kirksville is often flooded, but very few residential properties are affected. So it's not been a major issue with the public. Commercial properties on brownfield sites are at greater risk, but only from major floods. Around the year 2000, there were a series of minor floods and near misses, which caused public concern, especially in Leeds city centre. And that started people thinking about how the provision could be improved. The Environment Agency, as you've already heard, published a passive flood defence proposal in around 2007, which required enormous earthworks and was very expensive. That scheme faced considerable opposition and attracted very little support. It was obvious to most of us who thought about it that Leeds needed active flood storage, where you'd only bring the reserves into use at the peak of the flood. In other words, water would flow through Leeds anyway, you didn't need to bother about it. It was the stuff that wouldn't go through that you needed to store. Well, I used the FOI Act to get the LiDAR data from the Environment Agency. It worked. First time they'd done one. And I also received some tuition in GIS from Leeds University. I want to acknowledge that. But I set out to do my own flood model. And I could show, with fairly basic arithmetic, there was sufficient flood storage capacity to protect the whole of Leeds if Rodley and Calverley storage areas were combined. But if you only had one of them, as we have at present, it's tight. In fact, it didn't, for my model, it didn't actually work. After the Boxing Day floods in 2015, there were endless discussions between council officers, landowners, politicians, individuals, community groups from 2016 to 2018. There was general support for schemes involving movable weirs and natural flood management, and opposition to hard edge solutions, particularly using sheet steel piling. I'm going to use that abbreviation SSP for sheet steel piling and the like. In January 2018, a press release announced the Rodley flood storage area would be deleted from the proposals, and this became the focus of FAS new letter in February. Had I known about this, I'd have been very concerned because I understood the implications for Kirksville. However, I was on holiday in Mexico at the time and blissfully unaware of what was taking place in Leeds. The hybrid planning application was submitted in November, and I was delighted to see footpaths, bridges, green space provision in addition to the engineering works. We were advised the full scheme wasn't completely ready and we should expect to receive updates and amendments as the proposals bedded in. Still unaware of the Rodley decision, did not find out until planning consent had actually been granted. I'm certainly not disputing the professionalism, hard work and ingenuity that have gone into our flood alleviation schemes. I'm sure that all this work was done to an excellent standard. But I'm also concerned about two additional factors, which I don't think form part of our standard assessment, and I think where further gains are possible. First factor is biodiversity, which in my view is a powerful reason to minimise our use of SSP. There hasn't been a great deal published in SSP biology, but the little that exists is very negative. But I can see the problem clearly. SSP replaces gently shelving horizontal beaches at the water margin with hard, hostile, vertical surfaces where many species will struggle to survive. Almost any alternative surface, brickwork for example, seems better than steel, but it's the impervious vertical structure is a problem. No tunneling or boring animal can expect to get through it. So rats and lots of other biology, it simply doesn't happen with SSP. Canalised rivers become death traps for humans and animals alike. The second factor is land. Representing an inner city ward, I'm constantly aware of the need for recreational open spaces. In addition to formal sports provision, I'm seeking opportunities for rewilding and for new pedestrian routes. I want to release land for nature, including humans, in the most densely populated parts of the inner city and replace the lost economic resources in areas that have got more space to spare. So de-densifying the inner city. There are three, in Kirksville, our sheep piling is almost complete. At first sight, this looks like a peaceful outcome for a potentially difficult situation. I certainly don't want to unpick any of the decisions we've taken. But if we study the details, this wasn't a particularly good way to resolve the various conflicts. In future, we should all try to do better. And here are three significant problems that I hope to resolve. One, flood storage capacity. If we permanently abandon the flood storage space at Rodley, this requires compensatory adjustments elsewhere. Now, in 2018, FAS2 started on a search for alternative storage spaces in Horsforth. I never heard the outcome from that study. It was on the TV, but I'd like to know the outcome, how much additional storage space we managed to recruit and whether we're able to bring it into play, because it does improve our performance. Second point, Kirksville Meadows. This is the area near to Kirksville Abbey, which is going to be a wildlife reserve. I understand that humans are excluded from this wetland, but we're bringing 3 adjacent rugby pitches into use. It isn't clear to me how this is going to be achieved or who will have access to the finished works. You may have noticed that rugby matches are occasionally subject to shouting and unparliamentary language, a lot of disturbance. So we're going to put it back next to a pristine nature area where we're trying to keep delicate and frightened species there. It's not going to go too well. And finally, flooding at Kirksville Valley Farm and the adjacent allotment site where I declare an interest, I've got an allotment there. It's useful to compare the 1799 layout at Burley Mills when it was first built with the scheme now under construction at the rear of Waterside House on Kirksville Road. The 1799 version had 8 penstocks to regulate the flow. It took the whole river, basically. And there was barriers at the weir and no regulation on the outflow side. So they regulated the input and let the outlet do whatever it would do. 2022 version has no regulation on the input. There's no adjustment at the input side. It has multiple gates inside Burley Mills and a big pump and quite a complicated system, but the inlet isn't regulated. People are concerned that the Burley Mills administration may close the valves at Burley Mills. It makes it more convenient for them. But the Goit is still connected to the weir, and the water level in the upper section of the Goit will track the water level above the main river, above the weir. The outcome depends on the river level. If this remains low, then there is no problem. But as the water level increases, there'll come a point where the Goyt starts to overflow through the farm gate and onto the main farmland. This comes well before the point where the farm would flood anyway, a phrase that's been used to me, because the Goyt is being fed from above the weir, the farm is being fed from below the weir. There's over a metre of difference between them. So it's not, the timing is not ideal. So they get river water into the farm, which causes a problem. It could be contaminated with raw sewage, which makes our produce difficult to sell. And they also put the farm's organic certification at risk. So those are points which I don't think have been adequately covered in the present design, but I want to go back and revisit them and polish them, basically. Now, I don't want to exceed my time, Chair, so I've got one more point to make and then I'm going to shut up. 90 seconds. Okay, I'll do it. Right. It's about the flow control structure at Kirksville Abbey, which I remind people is a Grade 1 ancient monument. I don't like the flow controller for Abbey Mill Goyt. It's aesthetically unpleasing. I think we can do better if we have to do better. And also, it works. The thing doesn't need fixing. If it ain't bust, don't fix it. There presently is a flow controller that's presently in use. It's been certainly in use all the time I've been a councillor, over 40 years, 2 years more than you, Chair. It's something where I don't want to damage it. I'm quite happy with the existing arrangements. I think they will work perfectly well on a do-nothing basis, and it's going to cost £1 million for a new flow controller. I haven't got. If I had £1 million in Kirksville, I wouldn't spend it on this. And I hope you see what I mean. It's a question of value for money and spending money wisely. I think we can manage with the old flow controller, and I'd like us to try that out first before we commit any more funds, Chair.
Well done, John. 20 seconds within your time. So now turning to the executive board member and the officers, are there any points that you would like to pick up? I'm sure there are from what John has laid before us.
Thank you very much, Chair and Councillor Lingworth. I think some of the comments you've made there, Councillor Lingworth, I feel have been addressed, certainly to an extent, in Appendix 2, which is the officer response to the report, which I'm more than happy to talk through. The maybe 1 or 2 points that we can take away and provide a response separately. Yeah, excuse me, Chair, I'm not sure what format you'd like me to sort of take in terms of, I can give some immediate responses to some of those comments.
Yeah, Richard, I think it would be really useful to respond to the specific points that Councillor Illingworth has highlighted. We obviously, hopefully all have read the report, and clearly we've got the initial email that Councillor Illingworth sent to us, but he has now elaborated on a number of those and focused in specific terms on various aspects. So I think they would be the points that we would like you to respond to if possible.
Yeah, I'll certainly attempt to do so then. So go on then, starting from the final point and working backwards, because that's maybe the one that's, sorry?
Just said that the point where we raised about saving £1 million.
Yeah, go on then. Yeah, that's the one. So if you refer to the report in paragraph 14, people have got that in front of them there, in terms of the historic flow control structure. Yeah, a couple of things to note there. And our design team feel it's just not feasible to actually use to prevent flood flows at that location. And secondly, the condition that it's in, similarly, it'd just be impossible to adopt that as a modern day flood asset. But clearly the historic nature is absolutely fully appreciated, and we are retaining it for historical contextual purposes. In terms of the money for that actual piece of flood defence, I've not got that in front of me. I'm not sure where Councillor Worth has that information from. However, what I would say is the overall cost of the scheme is fully funded, and the vast majority is government funding that's been granted to the City Council to use to prevent flooding in this area, as opposed to then to be provided for other purposes. So it's already accounted for and budgeted for and going ahead. So that was the final point. And then again, in the order of which I've made my notes, there was a comment there on Kirksville Valley Farm, which again, if you refer to the report in paragraph 8, I think previously, Councillor Worth, you've expressed a concern about the, I think you've said there that you feel that there's an increase in flood risk to Kirksville Valley Farm. We've tried to explain there that actually it's an increase in flood depth rather than increase in flood risk. And the flood depth increase comes at a time when that particularly pocket of land is already in flood. And to give that some context, there's no difference in the depth of flooding at a 1 in 10 year event. But the extreme of a 1 in 200 year event, the difference in depth is 150 millimeters. But that's actually at a point when the site is already experiencing depths of between 750 millimeters and 1.5 meters. In terms of the engagement and being unaware of the decisions that have taken place, and specifically around Rodley Nature Reserve, and I'd probably refer to paragraph 3 there, and the flood modelling that's been undertaken. So what the City Council has done there is made best use of external national professionals in their field. And Councillor Illingworth and I and lots of the modelling team have met on a number of occasions to go through the modelling. And you quite rightly point out that Rodley was identified as a significant potential storage area. And at one time, at an earlier stage, we did explore extensively the use of Rodley and Calverley. But after listening very carefully to representations made by Rodley Nature Reserve, the decision was actually made and reported to the executive board to progress with Calverley as a single storage area rather than Rodley and Calverley combined. But in paragraph 4, I'll then go on to say that actually, if Rodley and Calverley had both been progressed, there was actually only a relatively small reduction in defence heights, the linear defences, of around 75 millimetres. And in fact, the linear defences that we are introducing are fully compatible, and hope maybe some people have seen certainly some of those already completed some years ago as part of phase 1 and now being completed as part of phase 2. A lot of work has gone into trying to reduce those as far as possible and make them sort of connect with the river rather than the original proposal, which was a high Berlin Wall solution, which we've obviously didn't go ahead with, and it's like chalk and cheese between the two. And so I'd probably say that this was, you could say, was maybe a good example of engagement with the communities and how we've listened to communities, that there was quite a lot of adverse feedback to using Rodley Nature Reserve, and so we've taken that on board and listened to those, and in the end didn't progress with Rodley as a storage area. In terms of the land release and managed retreat, which I think has been referred to in the past, I'd probably refer to paragraph 12 there. One option could have been to, as you say, to do a managed retreat and let areas of Kirksville flood, so to speak, and sort of move residential and commercial properties out of Kirksville area and up the hill, so to speak. However, that wasn't the criteria and the brief that was set by government in the aftermath of the 2015, and I suppose it would have been a very complex situation to deal with. I'd imagine that you'd probably have a range of stakeholders with varying opinions on that approach. And so the brief that was set was to prevent flooding and bring forward a scheme that meets the criteria set by government in order to get this 160 million pounds worth of funding. And so yeah, in the end, we've brought on board a holistic flood defence scheme, which tries to deal with the problem at source, catchment-wide approach, a storage area, natural flood management scheme, and then a residual linear defence scheme. In terms of the residential properties being protected, I'd refer to paragraph 16 there. Yeah, Fast 2 will in fact better protect over 1,000 residential properties, aside from 360 existing businesses, and also unlock housing for around 1,600 new homes. The HM Treasury rules have been strictly adhered to with this business case, and that shows, and it's been heavily scrutinised by the Environment Agency's Large Project Review Group, the DEFRA Executive Commission, and in fact HMT as well. That actually shows a benefit to cost ratio of 9.4, and so yeah, 162 million pounds is a significant amount of money, but if it's producing a benefit to cost ratio of almost 10, it's a large return. And I'd probably say that the 162 million pound is in today's money, whereas the original Environment Agency scheme, which was abandoned in 2013, was estimated to cost over 180 million pounds at that time. Since then, you know, we've had almost 10 years, a global pandemic, significant inflation pressures, and a large funding gap to resolve, and you know, we've brought forward this scheme at pace. Yeah, they're all the notes I made. I'm not sure if there's sort of further commentary to add to that.
Well, according to my notes, and I may have missed something, but there was another issue that Councillor Illingworth raised about the Kirksville Meadows wildlife sanctuary, or however you want to describe it, and the possible impact of nearby human activity relating to the rugby pitches. I don't think you've covered that. Am I right in that, John? That was one of the issues that you contribute again.
Yeah, yes, Chair. You're accurate.
Yeah, Chair, so I was just clarifying with Richard. The Kirksville Meadows has been laid out as rugby pitches historically and still is, albeit there is a challenge with their use, because in planning policy terms, playing pitches are compatible with a flood area, a flood zone, and that site has sat in a zone that has been susceptible for flooding, and so the Environment Agency, in terms of its statutory role that it plays, will say that those pitches are compatible. Because of historic flooding, when they flood, they suffer from contamination from the flood water, and that, whilst the policy position is that they're compatible, the reality is something perhaps different, which is why some of them are redundant. But in the planning consent for this scheme, 2 of them are have been used in the recent past and remain current. So in terms of Sport England's statutory consultee role on the pitches, they had a statutory consultee role on 2 of them as live pitches that have been used within the last 5 years. but not on 3 of them that, whilst they're still there with the posts, are not used. So I think what I would say is that over the long term, they have been used as rugby pitches, and part of the site will continue to be used as rugby pitches going forward. Just to say that and they are in private ownership, Chair.
Okay.
I think just to sort of add to that as well, in terms of the noise pollution that's being referred to, I think we'd probably say that's no worse than any. It's certainly no louder, and in fact, no more disrupted any passing by vehicular traffic. And in terms of the environmental impacts, I'd probably refer to paragraphs 5, 6, and 7. The scheme attempts to take all possible opportunities in terms of improving everything as we possibly can do. So we actually had Sir Professor John Lawton, and part of the programme board, who's the chair of Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and a specialist in this field, and he was a very active part of the board. And so the environmental impacts, very much endorsed in terms of the mitigation that was brought forward for the scheme. One example is Kirksville Meadows, but there's lots of other examples as well. Not least the 2 million trees that we're planting as part of the scheme as well elsewhere in the catchment.
Okay, do any members have any questions or comments? If you're still cogitating on that, can I? Nico.
Thanks, Chair. In the outset of John's presentation, he said the majority of flood damage in Kirksville is commercial, not residential properties. And it touches on paragraph 16, how many residential and commercial properties are. I just wondered, is there any data to the actual amount of flood damage there has been in Kirksville? Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, right. In terms of the project team, we've got an enormous amount of data which form part of the business plan, which showed the damage that was occurred in Kirksville as part of the Boxing Day 2015 flood. I haven't actually got that statistic in front of me, but I will provide it to all the board members later on. But rest assured that, a huge impact, both direct and indirectly as well, to the economy and investor confidence as well.
Helen and then John.
It's worth noting that I was at the economic benefits from protecting those properties from flooding. I was at the Yorkshire and Humber Flooding Forum in York yesterday, and the statistic is for every £1 spent on protecting the property, it saves £5 in renovation and clean-up costs in the future, as well as the fact that insurance prices are incredibly high for those residential properties. There's also the carbon savings. It's actually uses a huge amount of carbon to clean up after a flood, rather than much more than to actually build these flood defences. So we're saving not only money in the long term, but carbon as well. So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
John, I suspect you're going to be providing an answer to the original question.
Yes, Chair. There's a lot of confusion over this, and understandable. But I volunteered for the cleanup operation in Kirksville. The politicians all did, and we were at it for several weeks, and intimate knowledge of the damage that was done. And I have to say, in terms of residential properties, the damage was very small. Four house basements on Kirksville Road, and that was it. The total property damage in the housing sector was 4 basements, not a huge amount. And they drained naturally. We wondered if you had to get the fire brigade in to pump them out. Didn't need to bother. It's sandy soil. As the river went down, the basements emptied, very passive. What there is there is a industrial estate built on former housing near the river. And that obviously bypasses all the planning controls. It's floodplain development. It flooded. The people came out in tears saying, we didn't expect this to happen. They're parked in a bloody floodplain, for heaven's sake, and it washed through. And
John,
upsetting. Yes.
Quite happy for you to make all these kind of broader comments, but I was really just giving you the opportunity to answer the question about the number of properties.
Was there four?
But you can,
Four, is it?
but you will be coming back in later when you can make all these points. Helen.
It really doesn't matter if it's only just for the devastation of even just having your basement flooded. It's the stress that it causes, knowing that your property can be flooded. And I've never lived in a property that got flooded, but I know from areas, and Councillor Sharp will back me up on this, in the Dunnell area of our ward, that the stress it causes when there is a storm, and despite all the protections that are in place, and the new Kirksville Meadows, which is Killingbeck Meadows, I've got my wrong K there, which will provide really good protection going forward. The stress is still felt every time the rain starts, and we know that from our inbox, and that is perfectly understandable. And but it's the threat of flooding, and what we saw in Otley, where the brand new a very natural alleviation scheme protected those 53 properties. And yes, most of them normally get flooding into their basement, but the stress it causes to those families, and they were so relieved. And we're talking about children here, and kids not being able to get to school because the hospital being cut off in Otley. And it's the same in Kirksville. If roads are flooded, how do people get around, including to educational establishments? And the stress it causes. Over in Lancashire, we've got children with PTSD after flooding events. So we really do want to protect those properties from any further damage and for very many reasons, including it happening on Boxing Day, there wasn't that devastation that we've seen in other parts of the country at the same time and at other times in the recent past. Thank you.
Martin.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, I just want to emphasise the point that this is an integrated whole catchment flood scheme, and there's a danger of deconstructing it down to various parts of the city. But effectively, what this scheme is doing is it's starting its physical works at Appley Bridge in Bradford, just on the other side of the Leeds border, and the Phase 1 works started at Woodlesford. 12 miles down the River Aire catchment, and across that catchment, the totality of these works protect a large number of residential properties. And paragraph 1 points out that on 2015 Boxing Day floods, there was wide-reaching damage of almost 3,000 residential buildings. So I'd emphasise the whole catchment integrated approach, that because the river doesn't respect ward boundaries. We need to take a whole catchment integrated approach to our solution here.
Yeah, apologies, but just to sort of add to that in terms of small commercial properties, this isn't large commercial organisations, but small commercial businesses. The reality is that they're faced with a situation where their insurance companies either just won't provide them with a proposal or cover, or even if they do, the premium costs tens and tens and tens of thousands of pounds, and then they're faced with excesses of tens and tens of thousands of pounds. So you actually see in reality of small businesses just don't bother with their insurance, and so there'll be a lot of properties there that just can't get affordable insurance to cover flood events, and so that would mean that if a lot of them went out of business because of Storm Eva, and God forbid another event happens again, the ones that did return are most likely faced with a situation that they'd be wiped out again.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I had two questions. Martin's answered one of them about the integrated nature of the scheme rather than being able to pick and mix. But could I just ask about the Rodley storage proposal, which obviously Councillor Illingworth focused on as being important in terms of the case that he was making. There were clearly representations, forceful and cogent representations made from Rodley Nature Reserve, and it says other community groups, but it doesn't specify. How many representations were made from Kirksville?
I think I've not got an exact number, but I don't recall any formal objections to the planning process whatsoever. There were some representations made in some of the community sessions in Kirksville to say that they would prefer that we went ahead with more storage areas. But actually, there was nobody in Kirksville saying that they didn't want the defences that we were bringing forward. I don't know if that answers the question or makes sense.
Yeah, it does as far as you're able to. Richard Martin, you wanted to come back in.
Yeah, so it's just context in terms of how the scheme works, and I'll invite Peter and Richard to cut across me if I'm wrong in this. But effectively, as Richard outlined, there are three components to this scheme. There's the natural flood management, and that it's the old adage of if you want to solve a problem, find the source of the problem, and the source of the river Aire is at Malham. So we are doing that 2 million tree planting all the way up to Malham, and that slows the water down into the river course and is the first line of defence. The second line of defence is then the hard-edged engineering works that once that flood water that hasn't gone into the river course hits Leeds, that's designed to do. And effectively that provides a 1 in 100 year flood protection. So we're then left with the last line of defence, which is how do we address a 1 in 200 year event where there's a surge of water coming down from the Yorkshire Dales. We can anticipate through the EA's notifications of when it's going to hit Leeds. And that's where the flood attenuation comes in. And the modelling that was done by the team demonstrated that we could address that 1 in 200 year risk through the flood attenuation, through a scheme at Carverley and Horsforth, which is the scheme that's on site, and that we didn't therefore need the Rodley scheme to provide that level of protection. And in the context of the clear representations that were made, and made quite forcefully through the consultation about concerns about the Rodley element, that's why we decided to bring a paper forward to the council's executive board in the public domain to say that the final design of the scheme wouldn't include Rodley. And on the back of that executive board consent then that gave the mandate for the design of the scheme that we're going to go ahead and implement, the planning application, again in the public domain, came forward, which excluded Rodley. So I think that's the context within which that came forward, Chair, if it helps.
Does anyone want to add to that? Gary, were you signifying that you wish to speak?
Thank you, Chair. All I was going to say, because I remember the conversations with Rodley very well, and it was Councillor Richard Lewis who was our executive member at the time, and the conversations that he had and site meetings and visits undertaken. So I just relay that to the Scrutiny Board because there were very significant representations being made to the council about Rodley, and obviously culminated in the points that Martin has said in terms of a report ultimately going to the council's executive board to be ratified. So it's a bit of a personal recollection of the in-depth, detailed conversations that were going on around that particular topic.
Absolutely, and the threat there was that the scheme just wasn't deliverable. The representations that would be made would have been a much long, drawn-out process. It would have meant that the business case to the government would have been unhinged, and ultimately we wouldn't have had the money to and the grants that have been provided to the City Council to deliver this government-funded scheme.
Martin.
Yeah, it was just briefly again for context, and it was touched on earlier that the exam question, or the brief as it's outlined, was set by the Secretary of State for Environment, which was Liz Truss at the time. And so the design that came forward was a response to that brief. And in the context of a flood risk and in this sense, trying to prevent ultimately a 1 in 200 year event, that can happen at any time. And so the approach taken with the project is to make best use of time so that should that event occur, we've used our best endeavours to deliver the protection that the city needs so that the city is as best protected as possible if and when that occurs. So in the context of the representations at Rodley, the deliverability, etc., and whether we needed it, which technically we determined that we didn't, all of those factors then led to the decision that because it's not needed, because we need to deliver this essential flood protection for the city, we need to move forward with a scheme that's deliverable.
Okay, thank you. I've not seen any other indications. Oh, Mike.
Yeah, just touching on insurance. Has the scheme been presented to the insurance business? I'm just interested to know, you know, people that once this scheme's finished go to renew their insurance, are they going to get flood protection?
Yes, absolutely, and phase one is a good example of that. So the properties that are affected by phase one, they're in a similar situation where many of them were faced with unaffordable insurance premiums. The flood maps, everything like that, then gets updated as soon as the scheme is completed. All the insurance companies are made aware, and then yeah, everyone benefits from that system. It's a process it's in place.
Any other last minute questions or comments? Paul.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned the natural flood management, 2 million trees. If woodland creation in my ward is anything to go by, 2 million trees planted doesn't necessarily mean 2 million trees. I'm just wondering how the success of that is being measured and monitored.
Well, I chair the project board for the scheme. It's reported to me at every project board. I think the figure currently was 460,000 trees planted, and there was a figure for forecast for the next 12 months. Is it 330? Yeah. So the current position is we've planted 460,000 trees, and we forecast 330,000 over the next 12-month planting period.
Helen and then Gary.
Sorry, we both jumped up. Yeah, I mean, whether all those trees will survive, it's the majority will, and it's on the ongoing management. And I have to praise the project board because they're dealing with a lot of landowners up the whole catchment up to Malham. And the National Trust is doing some fantastic work up and around Malham with local farmers, both tenant and farm owners. Not all those trees will survive. That's the natural course of things, and there will be ongoing woodland management. And it has to say that we need to get them in the ground now because it takes about 15 years for them to actually have that flooding effect and to be properly soaking up the water that we needed to. But that's in the context of the hedgerows that are being planted, but leaky dams, of all different types. And there's a fantastic new facility at Boddington Fields for Leeds University who are trialling all these different types of natural flood management schemes, whether we use the plastic surrounds or not, and and different types of dams and those sinks and things like that. So there's a lot of work going on, and yeah, it's not just the trees. I just want to say that. Thank you.
And just to add to that, there is a maintenance arrangements in place so that if trees are spotted as dying, there is a requirement for them to be replaced. So we should get to, in fact, it was a question that was asked at the board this week, that very question. My final comment, Chair, was we're very grateful for Councillor Illingworth's comments right at the beginning of his session when he made compliments to the team, because the context here is that less than 10 years ago, the city had no flood defences, maybe 1 in 5, which effectively is negligible. So effectively no flood defences whatsoever. So within a decade, we've gone from a city that's been unprotected to one that will have one of the highest defences against flooding, major flooding in the country. And I think that's a major plaudit for the team, but obviously the council as well. And it was cross-party, as has been said, and the money that the council has put into it over the last 10 years.
Thank you, Gary. I'm going to pause for 5 seconds while anyone is moved to indicate they now wish to ask a further question or comment. No, okay. Right, so I think in terms of the process that we normally adopt in cases like this, it's now the opportunity for Councillor Illingworth to make some closing remarks. And John, I hope I'm not being too unfair. Given the fact that what we've heard is a scheme, a massive scheme that's been determined, that's been funded and that is progressing at pace, what do we actually feel that we as a scrutiny board can usefully add to the process?
I think that's what's called a curveball in many sports, but nevertheless appreciated. Yes, it's fascinating to watch this process because I see it one thing as a politician, another thing at the moment as a scientist, and a mathematician and so forth. It's a very different style of debating in different disciplines. They all have a part to play, but it is fascinating to listen to and to analyse in those terms. Well, on practical terms, I was asking this scrutiny board to pay some attention to this area. I think it's very much up to yourselves how much attention we pay, but I think it merits attention. It's a good story to tell, and occasionally there are some hard, indigestible lumps in the mixture, and that's not a thing to be afraid of. It's the job of the scrutiny board to iron these out, to deal with irritations and problems, and to facilitate the progress of the overall scheme. And I don't see any incompatibility there. I think any scheme of this sort of scale was likely to have glitches in it, and you make a proportionate response. You don't go overboard, but you do what's necessary to make sure the whole thing works. And that's very much what I'm hoping the board will do. Now, some of the things which I've raised are pretty minor glitches. I've listened to what you said. I think you've basically got the farm flooding wrong, as anybody can do. And I want to spend time with yourselves, not here, going through it again and looking for the snag, because I hope I can convince you that there is a snag and that we're proposing a different flooding mechanism, which isn't part of the model that you've run. And so that's something to do outside this room, but I'd like to do it and spend a bit of time making sure that the theory that we've got down here is actually accurate and working. Now, the other big theme which I think needs to be watched is about land release, managed retreat, and living conditions in a city. It isn't restricted to flood schemes at all. But my personal view is that the housing densities that we approach in the densest parts of Leeds, in the inner city and in Holbeck and around there, are too high for human health. And we were due to back off a bit and basically live people with, I meet in my casework a significant number of people with mental health problems, and they feel oppressed, and really, you describe some of those feelings of panic and so forth, but it's, I think, a symptom of overcrowding. So I would like to gently ease the population pressure on the highest density parts of the inner city, and that's one of the things I'm looking at when I said about managed release. It's walking away from the flood, leaving the land open. That's the reasoning behind it, and why I think it's worth consideration. On this scheme, we may be too far past it, but I'd still like you to look at it, because there'll be other schemes in the future where that decision needs to be taken. So I urge the board very strongly to look at housing densities and what measures, practical measures we can take to ease the pressure in the densest areas, and give people a bit of open space to walk around. So that's another take-home message that I want you to look at. And as regards the Meadows, Sport England and the Environment Agency, I'm aware from reading that there's a huge debate going on in nature conservation at the moment between the traditional approach, which had nature reserves sort of walled off. And you went to a nature reserve at Malham in North Yorkshire, and you looked around and you were separated, cut off from the ordinary punters weren't allowed in. You had to be on a book trip and so forth. And you'll see that in Leeds, in Adel, the Adel Nature Reserve there, at the quay, you have to let yourself in. Very informal, but nevertheless, that's the idea. And there's a younger, more modern generation of people involved in nature conservation who don't see in these terms. They say human beings are a natural species. They live on the earth, are the most successful top predator ever, and they're part of the picture. So their nature reserves are open access. They are regulated access, I think, but they are basically open to the public. And you try to stop any antisocial behaviour and destructiveness, but otherwise you don't worry about who's gone on them. And actually, I find that much more attractive. And I think it's much more suitable for a city like ours, which is fairly built up. And it's been a debate within Yorkshire Wildlife. So it isn't just me having a bee in my bonnet. And I think you ought to look very, very seriously at the managed approach, at letting more people into nature reserves, using them as an educational resource rather than to protect rare species. And I think that sums up the new thinking that's flowing through nature conservation. I certainly like to debate it with Yorkshire Wildlife and will hope to do so. So those are the basic messages. I think you do have a monitoring role. I hope you'll keep your eye on Leeds flood relief scheme to be pleased about it as well as critical, and that we shall return to this topic in due course and review what's happened. That would be my wish for the board to take on.
Okay, thank you, John. And now, Helen and the officers, do you want to give us your concluding comments?
Yeah, and please correct me. It feels like the summing up there, Councillor Illingworth, most of that was probably beyond the remit of the scope of the scheme that I'm responsible for dealing with. I suppose it was just that initial point there in terms of the flood modelling work. One observation that I'd probably make in response to that would be that there has been a high number of previous meetings and information shared on this specific topic, and common ground agreed at that time. I would need to re-engage external modelling specialists that were used for that part of the scheme, but if we feel that's a appropriate use of resource, then obviously I will contract that resource back in.
I mean, just some summary comments, Chair, but I mean, I think as it's been outlined, the scheme is a large and complex one. The brief was set by the Secretary of State that we were obligated to respond to. 90% of the funding for the scheme has come from government, so they have a critical role here, which was through their approval, both by the Environment Agency, DEFRA, and Her Majesty's Treasury, and it's that approved scheme that was also approved by Executive Board that our mandate is to deliver. To that end, we went on site in January 2020, so we're currently forecasting a conclusion in autumn 2023, so we're more than halfway through the delivery of the scheme. The point I didn't quite understand from Councillor Illingworth's points on Kirksville Meadows is, and it might be a different site, but I see Kirksville Meadows as a privately owned piece of land that is currently rugby pitches in terms of how it's laid out, and the landowner has a desire for them to be used as rugby pitches if he can address their position in the floodplain. That they're not currently a formal nature reserve in the eyes of the landowner.
I'd just like to say to tribute, I mean, this started before I became a councillor, but to deliver this type of whole catchment scheme in 10 years is incredible, with all the complexity that people have talked about and Martin's just mentioned here. It's innovative as well. If you look at the movable weirs in the city centre, the fact that the walls are glass so that we can have that amenity space and enjoy being down by the river, to tiny little things like the steps up, and that's actually near a bridge over the in the city centre. That's actually a flood defence mechanism, but nobody would ever notice that it was one of this. The days of building walls, thankfully, were got rid of, and Gary and I got into trouble from the Environment Agency for mentioning that. But you know, it was true that they were going to be over 3 meters high, which would have been horrific in these, in both in Kirksville, the city centre, and other places as well. So I'm really pleased from a climate emergency and an ecological emergency that so much is attention is being paid to biodiversity and natural flood management. And including Kirksville Meadows, and I like my eel slides and otter runs and salmon jumps and all the rest of it that are, you know, beside the weirs in the city centre, and people should have a walk around. It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating, and I've been very lucky to be able to do so. We are nearly finished this. So in terms of going and changing anything, that's very difficult. It went through all the statutory planning processes. We can't, as a council, you can't be held accountable that if somebody misses those communications, those emails, those communications that are put out in the normal planning way, or exec board reports. And I've never been lucky enough to go to Mexico. Yeah, I you know, we can't be held responsible for what some people may or may not see, and it has to be taken in the whole catchment. That's the way that the world's going. We used to focus on, as a country, we used to focus on that immediate problem, but actually the problem starts up at Malham, where Martin and I spent a very cold, snowy day filming up there. So yeah, and I'm really, really pleased from ecological climate emergency and the flood protection that this will give to people who quite rightly are very nervous in the centre of Leeds after Boxing Day 2015. So thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Helen. I think I now have a very difficult position in chair to kind of summarise where we might go. Actually, I think it's probably much more simple than the very detailed and complicated discussion that we've had might suggest. As I think John has acknowledged and Helen has quite rightly reinforced, this is a scheme where our intervention is not possible. We reached a stage where I don't think there's anything useful we can do. However, we do have a corporate responsibility as a scrutiny board, at least every year, to have a report on the flood risk management scheme stroke plan. And I think that that is a good opportunity for us to rehearse some of the points that John's made about phase 2 and the measures that are currently unfolding. But I think also when other measures are being put forward and discussed, probably of a much, much more limited and local scale, nevertheless, some of the points that he's made in respect of this scheme should be applied to those, and we can ask the questions in respect of them. Richard, could I just come back to you? Were you acquiescing in Councillor Illingworth's request to meet further with you to discuss the issue of the farm?
As I say, if we feel that's a good use of resource, but what I would point out and just reinforce is that we have had several other meetings already, and I think in order to maybe respond to the detailed calculations which Councillor Illingworth probably wants to sort of scrutinise, I would have to recontract with the specialist national modelling contractors that we had at the time, which obviously you may appreciate that given where we are with the scheme. They're currently not actively involved with the day-to-day running, but I'm happy to do that if we feel that would be productive. Obviously, I'll do what I'm told.
Well, we don't tell you to do anything. We make recommendations. No. You are told what to do by the executive board member and the
Can I say, as the executive board member, I can't see how that would be a good use of resources and of money. And if we want to spend, you know, this scheme has come out 20 million less than the original scheme that was left. I'd rather spend that money on planting a few more trees. Thanks.
Do members have any views on this? I'll be guided by you in the light of John's request and the comments that have been made by officers and Helen.
Can I just say that we appreciate and we admire, and obviously Leeds has come a long way with flood defence over the years, and Councillor Illingsworth has had a lot to say about it. However, Councillor Illingsworth has offered wanting a meeting to show his model. I'm finding it quite difficult why it would cost a fortune to meet with him to go through his model.
Because we'd have to get in outside consultants in again who charge a fortune.
Yeah, Sharon, it's not just an issue of John meeting with the officers. I think that would be straightforward, and I don't think they would find a problem with that. It's having to recommission the specialists who provide advice and who presumably could comment on the data that Councillor Illingworth feels he's got to put forward. So I think that's what Councillor Hayden was referring to, not just a meeting, but the resource implication of recommissioning those experts. And Martin, were you wanting to come back on that?
It was just it's the hydrological modelers who have concluded their work, and bringing them in to receive what Councillor Illingworth says, look at it, interrogate it, come to their own conclusions, and then come back, and that's where the cost is.
No, John, I don't think we can get into backwards and forwards, but go on if you can summarise in a couple of seconds what you wanted to say.
A couple of seconds. I was going to say we have some much cheaper expertise in Leeds, which is the climate emergency steering people. There's enough expertise on that board who are local to us, and we don't charge a fortune to resolve this issue. It doesn't actually need to bring in national consultancy. It's something which we could do in-house.
Okay, I don't intend for this to get into bouncing backwards and forwards, but Martin, Helen, Richard, what's your view on that?
It's a matter for the hydrological experts, yeah. Chair. It's not about semi-informed comment, because ultimately anything that comes forward, and the Environment Agency would have to be satisfied, and it's about a detailed, modelled evidence base from an assured source. Because this is a formal flood defence scheme. It's not something that's been pulled together by semi-informed people that have some knowledge in this area. It's got to be an accredited scheme.
As far as I understand, the scheme is set in place. It's going ahead no matter what, because it's been approved and it's been to planning and it's been to wherever it needed to go. However, having a look at someone else's opinion about someone else's opinion about what they think should happen isn't going to affect the scheme, is it? It's just seeing it. It's already, there is nothing that can be done what John come up with. It's just for future, isn't it? Or they could look at it and say, we never thought of that. You know, I just think you all put in a lot of block in the way, you know, rather than just, we're not talking about bringing in all the experts or whatever. John just want Leeds City Council staff to just have a look at it. You know, there's no matter what John shows at this moment in time, it's going to change the scheme as far as I understand it. You know, it's already set in stone, John, and you can't budget, but there's nothing wrong with me looking at your ideas, you know. That's how I look at things. And please just, I'm sure John's not thinking of bringing all the expert to change the scheme. It's been approved by everybody already, and it's going ahead, and it's not going to be stopped, and nothing new is going to change it. But give Councillor Illingsworth a chance to look at his model.
Look, I'm people know me around the board. I'm more than happy for officers or myself to meet with anybody to discuss things. What I don't want to do is to get into the modelling side, because that would take experts, as been already been shown. Councillor Illingworth, though, to assure Councillor Hamilton, Councillor Illingworth has had many meetings over the years on this scheme, and Richard has met with him on a number of times.
With the specialist modelling team.
With the specialist modelling team. So I'm afraid officers will do as they're told. They will meet with Councillor Illingworth, but we're not going to get into the modelling, and therefore Councillor Illingworth's scheme cannot be incorporated into this very complex big scheme. So, but if Councillor Illingworth wants to meet with officers on the kind of looking at monitoring how the scheme is being implemented, I think that might be a better use of time and resources. Thank you.
I think your statement is pretty categorical there, Helen, that at the end of the day, we don't instruct you what to do. We make recommendations, and the decision is made by senior officers and yourself as executive board member. And you're quite clearly indicating to us that you would not be prepared to open this up to the extent of recommissioning work from those who could crunch the numbers that Councillor Illingworth would wish. So if Councillor Illingworth wishes to meet with the officers, then I'm sure there's no problem with that, and yourself. Yes, yeah. And I'm sure we can make that recommendation. But I think what he was talking about was a much more sophisticated crunching of the numbers and the case that he thinks he's got. We don't want it coming back here. I'm not prepared, and I don't think the board would be prepared to have a to-ing and fro-ing. But am I right in saying that categorically you're saying that the exercise and the recommissioning of the external expertise is something that you are not prepared to sanction?
Yes, you're correct in that assumption. Thank you.
Right. Okay. So I think the meeting can take place on the basis of it being with officers and with yourself, Helen, if you wish to engage in that, but not on the basis of re-engaging the consultants, which, for the reasons that I think Sharon and others have mentioned, would strike me as being an expensive waste of resources and time. Okay, the other point I was going to make is that John's wider point, and he always manages to work in some wider issues relating to things like housing densities and open space. And that does fall within the remit of the Scrutiny Board, and especially in terms of our follow-up to our long-standing inquiry on housing mix. And that's something that, again, together with our overview of the planning process, we can certainly take on board, John, and indeed we do when those issues come before us. So I think we've got a way forward. I'm not sure it wholly satisfies you, John, but you have had the opportunity to elucidate at some length your concerns. And I do think that if you had chosen to bring it to the board at a much, much earlier stage, it might have been possible to influence things a little bit more. Maybe not, but I think that would have been far more appropriate than doing it at this stage. So with that, can we agree those ways forward that I've suggested? There will be a minute, and obviously if members don't feel that it reflects the discussion or what I've just mentioned by way of summing up, then clearly we can amend it if necessary. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. That takes us on to agenda item 11, sources of work for the Scrutiny Board. As I indicated at the pre-meeting, these papers are not here to be looked at in terms of their detailed content. They're intended simply to give a kind of panoramic view of this board's area of responsibility and overview. I'd reiterate the fact that we have limited resources. You will see from the next item on the agenda, I think it is, that we already have quite an extensive work programme. A lot of that is based on following up previous inquiries and updating them, and updating some of them in the light of discussions like the ones we've had today over the KPIs and John's comments relating to flood risk management. So can we perhaps note that, but that doesn't preclude us during the course of the year identifying areas that we might want to look at in more detail. And I'm just wondering, and I say this with some trepidation because I don't want to open up a wider debate, but maybe it would be useful to have a paper that looks at those areas for which this scrutiny board has an overview in the context of the impact of the pandemic, the response, the way forward, looking at how in particular the measures that are being planned on a corporate and hopefully coordinated basis address issues of inclusive growth and economic and other inequalities, so that that becomes, if you like, a golden thread running through all the other issues that we look at during the course of the year. Would that seem to be a kind of sensible thing to do? Don't all nod vigorously, whatever you do. We'll do that anyway, and it may be a paper to the board, or it may be something that we just share informally, or maybe have a working group about. So yeah, if you're content for us to proceed on that basis. Okay, and I think that hopefully brings us, I'm shuffling through my papers, to the work schedule. As I say, this is a draft document, although you will find that most of what it contains will be areas of scrutiny that we will undertake over the course of the next year. However, there may well be further referrals in due course from other elected members. There may be call-ins, which we occasionally get to deal with, that come under our remit. So that kind of concludes the meeting, and thank you very much everyone for your attendance. This is not a usual first meeting. Usually the first meeting is pretty tedious, and you may feel that this has been tedious in some respects, but it's just a housekeeping meeting. But we have had two substantive items, which is the reason why it's probably gone on a little bit longer. But I think we've had a really good and productive discussion. Thank you very much everyone for your attendance and contribution. Becky wants me or her to note that the next meeting has an earlier start time. I suspect because the room is needed by exec board in the afternoon. Okay, so look out for that. And certainly if anyone especially newer members, want to raise any issues with me or Becky about the issues we've discussed today or the wider operation of the board, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. Okay, thanks very much, everyone.